So today we have with us Cara Ellison, the writer of The Final Girls, which is a series in Comixology with art by Sally Cantirino and coloring by Cap Contreras and letters by Jomet Hill and edited by Cathy Wells. Cathy Wells? Yeah. Okay. So I got everything right. And it's an amazing series. Cathy West, yeah. Right. So it's an amazing series that is about restorative justice within a context of superheroes. It kind of delves around the like depths of the superhero and the saving the people and the legalization and illegalization of superheroes and all those things that go around this comics culture in general. And it takes a spin into it to like make it talk about a case of sexual assault within the superhero community, and it deals with the process of trying to bring justice into that. That's mostly the comic for the people who are interested in reading it. And then it's like the tone is very like humorous, and it's kind of has this noir style into it. Sally's style is very like noir, very like crude even sometimes, and it's, I don't know. I love it. You can read my review about it. I guess I was very excited about it, and I think it talks about some things that are generally very important to talk about. How a year a little bit less ago, we have a very a strong Me Too movement within comics that I think this comic like reflects very importantly. So I'm really excited to work with Cara. And she's also a game developer designer of narrative designer. And we can also talk a little bit about that.
Sure.
So the first of all that I want to ask you is about The Final Girls. Are you excited about reading this comic? And that's...
So I'm really, really excited about obviously women reading it, which includes trans women and includes, you know, every kind of woman. But I also feel like what's really important to me is that it reaches people who might otherwise feel like they feel alone, because a lot of abuse happens in, like, you know, close communities and, like, you know, places where you feel like you might depend on people a lot, you know, and you might depend on their goodwill or, you know, their friendship in order to be able to survive. And that's a really hard thing to experience. And I really wanted it to reach those people too, because I think, you know, even if you feel like you've got free of that kind of thing, it definitely weighs on you, you know, and I feel like that is like something that's really, really hard to talk about. And as a writer who's really interested in, you know, leveling up their craft and being able to try to address things that I personally find difficult to talk about myself, like that's what interests me as a creator, is trying to articulate something that's really difficult to articulate and trying to actually also make it feel welcoming to people and not like re-traumatize them and not make them feel like they're experiencing something horrible again. In fact, they're experiencing something that helps them cope and like is, you know, as you say, like funny and interesting, and all the characters are like not good at life, and actually they make a lot of mistakes and they misunderstand what's happening and they don't know what's going on. And so that to me makes the whole issue like a lot more human and a lot less like, I don't know, I think this, because this issue tends to be so serious and have such a serious impact on people, that I always feel like it's hard to make, you know, something like a comic or like a story around it, because it is rough, right? And you don't want to, like, especially like a piece of, and it's almost like, you know, treating it like entertainment is like a horrible idea. But also, like, you do want to start to have the wider world address harder topics and have them not be something that is ignored. And so the only way to do that, I think, is to try to bring a little bit into people's kind of worldview. And one of the ways is to try to make a story around it that's actually respectful and does try to kind of bring in lots of different perspectives, which all of the final girls, they have a different perspective on what's happening. They obviously, they make mistakes and like they're not totally certain what's going on. And I think that's what's interesting to me, is that they all understand like the power dynamic differently. And I think that's what makes it more like a human story and not really a superhero story, even though they are.
Yeah, I agree. Like the characters are like, when you get into the book, like when the first pages, it's like they're really like, they're not even far away from perfect. Like we usually in superhero comics are like used to these people that are like moral, like ethical measurements of life. And this book is not that at all, but it's also not like dehumanize it, because it humanizes every one of the final girls so much. And even not to spoil too much, but even in the moments in which one of them does something like is like really, you could say selfish or wrong, and also Ko in the beginning also like gets into situations that you could like judge as a reader. The comic understands them, and I feel like that's something very powerful, that is like it's making you face the facts that things that are not good or not perfect are still things that we can like fall into. And I feel like this is something that I'm really interested about how you thought that in the book, because there's a moment in the book, I think it's in the first issue probably, or where Ash like gets super mad and like big time, and it talks about how as a culture we kind of wait or fall or bad emotions into other victims sometimes, and kind of like don't hold a lot of empathy within that character. And I'm just interested in how you like managed to put all these complex feelings in the book, and if there's something about your own experience of other people, like put that. I don't know if I make the question clear.
No, in fact, I think you're circling around a really important thing, which is essentially that traumatized people, they often aim their anger horizontally and not vertically, because it's easier, right? Because you know that if you aim your anger vertically up the hierarchy, you will be punished and sometimes re-traumatized, right? So it's much easier to get angry at someone else who's experienced probably some of the same problems that you have. And that's what happens to Ash. Ash is angry at, someone who really doesn't have too much to do with her life. But what is happening is that she's feeling like her whole world is going to collapse. And therefore it's easier for her to be angry at one person than the person who's actually doing the harm. And that happens like a lot. And one of the hardest things for me to think about was, okay, so what's the answer to that, right, in a community? And one of the things I didn't want to do was say, well, it's obviously their survivor's job to find the solution, because it absolutely isn't. I think the solution is we take care of someone that this stuff has happened to, and we protect them. And how do we protect them? Well, we make sure that the person who's hurting that person is also surrounded by people who won't let them do it again. And they won't necessarily punish them, but they're not going to let them do it again. And they're going to ask them to try to do some kind of restoration process. And so that is a parallel process. It's not something that like one or the other, it has to happen at the same time. And that's why you need a whole structure based around it. And we do have a resource in the book where it lists all of these incredible writers who came before me, who essentially did that work of figuring out how to do that parallel process, how best to do it, how best to practice it, how it's not going to hurt anyone. And so that's really important. That's an important list. And obviously the book wouldn't have been complete without it, because we did so much research on it, and Katie in particular as well.
Yeah, I'm also like personally, well, for me it helped read this comic like a lot personally for my own story too, and now getting into the character that survives the sexual assault into Skazhats. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that well, and
Oh, well, so it's a hard thing to pronounce because it's very Scottish.
very
It's got
Scottish.
that trope sound in it, like Scafach. But she,
Okay.
yeah, she's an Irish Gaelic hero who turns up in Irish myth, and then Irish Gaelic is pronounced slightly different from Scottish Gaelic, but they're similar. You must know, like they're like kind of a Celtic language that is kind of spoken in lots of different pronunciations, and essentially there's she in Irish myth she has always lived on the west coast of Scotland, and she teaches all the other heroes how to fight, basically. So she's not very well known, but she teaches all the Irish heroes how to get their powers, and and she's kind of a cool figure, but she's quite often forgotten about. So I thought that would be an interesting Wonder Woman kind of figure, because she is the strongest woman in the world and she's still working, and but it was important for me to make her physically strong, because sexual assault isn't actually really about your physicality in any way. And I think as well, it's interesting to note that I know Brendan Fraser came out recently to talk about his kind of sexual assault experience in Hollywood. And obviously Brendan Fraser is a physically powerful man, and definitely was at the time. And so I think it was really interesting to kind of think about his experiences too, and actually kind of think about, well, this is actually, it's a structural thing. It's nothing to do with how strong you are, because if you make a fuss about anything in that structure that we have now, which is very capitalist, then you might not ever get work again. And a lot of people talk about, economic exile and not working again, and being kind of ostracized from the industry. So yeah, I wanted to kind of look at, how that would affect her and how afraid she would be and all those things. So yeah, so Skafak herself is like, obviously someone who everyone looks up to, but she's afraid of this thing and she doesn't know how to deal with it.
It touched me a lot personally, because I feel like it's a story that, even if in her case it's a very concrete story about the like most powerful woman in the world or something like that, it kind of speaks generally, like you said just a moment ago, about like unconventional survivals, and about a survivalship that is not necessarily about a cultural case of like you have this mobile and this is sexual assault and everything else is not got into the picture. And as a trans woman who has survived sexual assault, that was really, really powerful for me, because it really spoke to how I didn't understand the things that happened to me as sexual assault until like more time after it happened, because I was like understanding it through the lens of the culture in which that isn't, for some reason. And that, I feel like that's something that I needed to read in a comic. I needed to deal with a comic that like talk about unconventional stories. And I feel like there's another moment in the comic that is feel like it's really great, which is when you get that the assaulter thinks what he did wasn't like that bad, because it wasn't like what he saw on TV. And that really like, wow. And also it's like, it's very difficult to solve these things without telling them, without like speaking them. And I think that one thing that you did great in the comic is that you didn't speak them so much as you had simply the main character like absorb their feelings. So you have this experience in someone else, and you're not so much telling the reader, well, this is what you have to think about sexual assault. It's more like, I'm gonna show you that because of what we have learned in this culture, some people don't understand when they're taking out the limits of someone, especially someone that they consider like powerful or like wherever in a certain way. So I just want to ask you, like, how was to get these ideas like into, these are very like wow ideas, and I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, it was really, really hard to write, especially because I think for a lot of sexual assault survivors, it's really hard to, like you say, like process the event itself as being that horrible thing you see on TV. And also what's really hard is a lot of people are assaulted by people they know really well and who they love, and they want no harm to come to, and that is really confusing. As you feel this, like, I want to protect them from whatever forces of corporal punishment that might come to them. Other people will feel completely differently. They want that person punished and they want to have revenge, and I think those feelings are perfectly like legitimate. But I think for me, like, the bigger issue is like you say, processing the event itself is actually really hard. And so I think what the first issue, you might have noticed, doesn't have the R word in it at all. And that is because it does take people time to understand like where they can use it. And like, it is also really a very big allegation. And if you use the word sexual assault, that actually encompasses a lot of different boundary crossing that can happen. So it's actually in lots of ways a better term, because ultimately what it means is like, you crossed a boundary that was unacceptable to me. And I need you to recognize that. But yeah, we did have a lot of people who didn't understand that why the first issue didn't actually outright say that. And it's mainly because I think it takes you a while to, first of all, like you say, understand the whole issue. And it has to be a slow process of everyone involved understanding exactly what it means. And obviously in the second issue, it's all about like just doing that thing where it's like, beating the crap out of this guy. And that's what you kind of think that the comic is going to be all about, is this like revenge story where you're like, let's get this guy, let's ruin his life, let's like remove every kind of thing from him. And that's really not the end of the story. And it's also like the thing that most comics, especially superhero comics, and especially superhero comics written by men, they're obsessed with the idea that a woman gets hurt and then the guy goes off and does a revenge for them, right? And so it's kind of like a ridiculous trope at this point. And I really wanted to kind of get away from that. And I wanted to wrest that story away from men, especially, even though I think it's still a legitimate story. I love watching revenge stories like that. I think it's like exhilarating, and I think it's a great fantasy, but that's not the kind of fantasy I wanted to tell. I wanted to tell a different fantasy where women just dealt with the whole thing by themselves, and they just dealt with it within that community. And so I just felt like I wanted to like tell something completely different, where it was like, everyone accepts what happened to Skatach. There's no question, there's no re-traumatization, there's no like, oh, let's examine the details of what happened to you and whether or not they're true or false. What Ko does is she's just like, I know what happened to you, what do we do about it?
Yes. So since you talk about the first issue, there's something really interesting for me in this book, and it's part of my like points that I have more issues with, is that the first issue really like tricks the reader into thinking a lot of things that finally are not true. And one of them or are arguably not true, like are a gray area. And one of them is that Ko starts like the first issue saying like she cheated, and then she gets like what we later understand that is like disproportionately punished by the public media, which is not unusual. And well, I want to ask you like the risks you took in that first issue, because as you said, the first issue is like revenge story, and they're beating up guys like various times in the first issue and in the beginning of the second issue. And there's like this, like this introduction of the story that the relationship between these two girls starts with cheating, which I feel like is something that could drive away a lot of readers. And I'm so happy that it didn't drive me away. Like I was like, yeah, I need to know more. So like it drove me into the story, like being kind of, I don't know if mad at it, but like confused at it. And then I understood more. I understood more of where the relationship between those two girls comes from, more about the like unhealthy and toxic relationship that she had with her ex-husband, and they were like kind of already apart by that point, and more things that I don't want to spoil like too much, but I understood it. But in the first issue, it's like driving at you with a lot of preconceptions and making the reader be like, what do you think about this? Like, and I want to ask you, like, why do you take those decisions? And also if you feel like that's like some achievement in some way, because I feel like it could be in like changing the reader's mind. That's wow.
Well, ultimately, I think a big thing that I sometimes feel is that queer characters are often asked to carry too much, as in they are expected to be perfect. And that's obviously because media and politics have pushed so hard on queer people against, them even being represented, or especially, there's a tradition that the villain is always queer or queer coded. There are loads of ways in which queer characters and queer people have been villainized in media. And so what's happened now is that, queer people and queer characters now have to be perfect. And if they're not, then they don't get held up as being legitimate. And like, that's not true across the board, but what really, is upsetting is that it just means that like now it's kind of reflecting back on actual reality, like people who are essentially just regular people with regular faults and flaws, and they feel like they have to be like perfect all the time in order to be regarded as a person. And that's hard because obviously queer people are already, marginalized, and they're not, they're already having a rough time. So a lot of this is kind of about representing queer people as being, I think they should be able to have empathy from people without being perfect, without being this paragon of everything you ever wanted, And I think my bigger mistake, which in conversations between us that we definitely talked about, is not representing more of the final girls as being queer themselves, just Ko and Babanshi. But actually, I reread the comic the other day, and I actually did put more queer representation in the final, the last issue. You actually see Asua kiss her girlfriend in the memories that Ko has of them. And so you can also see that. And I obviously didn't land it well enough to be able to actually uncomplicate a lot of those things. And a lot of it was also up to the fact that I only had 5 issues to do this. We only wanted to do 5 issues because that meant that we could pay the contributors a lot more money to be able to be involved with the comics. So so that's actually a lot to do with my fault. Like I actually regard almost all of the final girls as being queer heroes, but obviously I didn't explicitly write that into the narrative. So that is a flaw of mine, that I didn't quite live up to everything I wanted with the comics. So it's really good that you've kind of brought it up, because I do feel like it's something that I didn't quite get right. But I also do feel like Babanshi and Ko's relationship, it's the central relationship of the whole comic, and it binds everything together. And also their relationship is so normalized within the comic, mainly because they are married, they are happy, They never really have they have like disagreements, but they don't like, they're just like normal. They're just like a normal couple, and you have this feeling that they're going to be married forever, and that's the way that is. And so I feel like I wanted to make that relationship central to the whole thing, because they are the rock on which everyone else rests in the comic. So yeah, you know, I think that she's definitely a man hater. So she really would never date a man. But Ko, I think she's like fully bisexual, and she's just someone who just kind of like is this kind of complex character who I think Ko regards herself as having cheated on her husband, but actually I think she's internalized a lot of the press narrative about her. I don't actually think that these days, at least, people would regard it as cheating. Mainly because I think that a lot of what happened to her was very, very complicated, as you'll see in the comic.
Yeah, I agree that when you get to issue 2 and 3, like, when you get more than issue 1, you finally get the bigger picture. And I feel like as a complex story of this character is perfect. Like I every time I have read it again, I have loved more their relationships. Even if the first time I was like, oh, I don't know how I feel about these two getting together this way and being the only like explicit, like you say, not the only, but the only central.
Exactly.
But I have read it again and again, and as you say, this feels very human. And I feel like, you know, it's not also the role of queer creators to make like every story possible. Like you made one that is very like understandable and complex and human, even if it starts very flawed. And I feel like that's also like very valuable in itself, and it doesn't have to have like every perfect thing ever. But yeah, I would love to see like all the final girls being explicitly queer on the page. It would have been great.
Yeah, that's definitely definitely something that I could do better at, or could have done better at this particular comic. But also, I do feel like, again, I was really, really limited by how much of the story, how complex it got, that I'm not making excuses. I am making excuses, but I feel like that structure in itself was like it was a lot to be able to fit in. So I think that suffered for it, definitely. However, just everyone know that they are much gayer than I have written. I have just basically made a giant excuse for myself, which I shouldn't. But
no, also like you took a lot of risks already. If you also took the risk of making all of them explicitly queer on the page, a lot of more people would be like, this book, because it is already very risky. I want all of them to be queer on the page, but I recognize that you are already taking a lot of risks in what you talk about, in how you say it, and in what you put on the page, especially for a comic that is like going to sell. Like, you know, that's something that I kind of understand that yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with you. The first issue is really risky, and that's actually why we released all of it at the same time, because the first issue is so complex, and so the setup is so complex and so risky that I was like, I think they'll need issue 2 to be able to understand what's happening for real. And I do think that it was this humongous risk, because I wanted to tell a much more complex story than I think the format was letting me do. And that's also, again, my own kind of flaw, because this is the first time I've done a creator-owned comic. Like before, I've only ever done like comics for anthologies with collaborators before. Obviously, Sally Cantorino is not her first time. But she was just like incredible, because she could like read what was on the page and then just give it this like, you know, those bits with Ash where like her anger is like swirling into these big kind of billowing tendrils. Like those are just like complete horror vibes. Like they're like, you know, that's like a horror comic-esque kind of feel. And that, like, actually bringing that to it was like amazing. And she would get all these amazing expressions out of the characters. Like, I really feel like she did an amazing job. And Gab Contreras, her colors are incredible. Like, there's you know, the lakes that you see in the comic, they have all these amazing colors of blue, and you know, just the way that she made Scotland look not this kind of, I think my biggest like the biggest thing that bugs me about like comics about Scotland, or like any story about Scotland, is there's this kind of like green brown palette, you know, like it's kind of all green and brown, and I'm just like, that's not the Scotland I know. It's like, I experienced Scotland in lots more like pop culture ways. And so it's like, you know, some of the best pop music in the world comes from Scotland. And, you know, to me, like the colors of, you know, the movie Trainspotting are kind of more what it's about. So yeah, so Gab brought that to it. That's why we hired her, because she's, you know, she's really incredible at that. So yeah, and I really love what Joe Matt did as well with you know, all the fonts that we use for it. They're my favorite too.
Yeah, the work of all of the, I feel like the comic, as a large creation, I feel like I haven't read a comic like this one about these topics and treating them in this way before this. So that I have to say, like, it's the first one for me, and that's a big one. And I also want to ask you about the setting, the Scottish setting of the characters, because that's a part that I couldn't get as much into in my reviews and everything, because I have not the experience to. But I want to ask you why these characters a little bit. You already talk a bit about the Scathas, but the other characters, and also the setting. A part that also like is just you, so you talk about what you know, but why do you do that?
Well, I mean, it was partly a reaction to, you know, like, I think at the time I was like still kind of annoyed about Outlander, because Outlander is essentially, it's you know, it's
yes,
it's an American set of books about Scotland that the TV show, I think, was made by an English production company, and then Scottish people are cast in it, which is cool and everything. But it is like a little stilted and weird because it's being seen through two outer lenses and onto Scotland, where it's not really Scottish enough for a piece of media that's like a piece of popular media. And it feels weird to watch. It's almost like a kind of, it's like how other people see Scotland being projected onto you. And it's like really, really strange. And so I just felt a bit weird about it at the time. So I was like, well, the Scotland I know is a little bit less, you know, romantic, and like, it is very wild, and it's very, you know, a lot of the landscape is very wild, but like people are like really funny and like silly and like kind of, they're very hospitable, and they can be very cynical. But I think there's like a lot of different aspects of Scotland that people hadn't really seen. And I just really wanted to kind of bring that to the fore, as well as a lot of the dialects of Scotland are not often heard outside of Scotland because they are very difficult for outsiders to understand. And so I was brought up in Aberdeen, which is on the east coast of Scotland. And that's a port town. And a fishing town, and it's basically a place where a dialect called Doric is spoken, and Doric is a result of a lot of different traders coming in and changing the way that Scots spoke, and so it's a really, really difficult dialect to understand. Like it sounds like nonsense to outsiders, but to me, like, it just sounds normal. So I just thought, you know, what is fun is just to have one character actually be completely unintelligible sometimes and not understand. But I feel like a lot of Scottish authors feel like they have to compromise themselves for the sake of a, you know, massive audience, to have that be read by people who get to understand it, which is fair. And I did compromise Ash a little bit because she speaks a little bit more English than she would have if she really was Aberdonian. So she uses some vernacular, and then some of it is English. And that's, again, like something that I did to compromise myself a little bit, but I did want her to be understood and to be empathized with, so I felt like that was a small kind of compromise I could make. But yeah, I definitely feel like Scotland has more to give pop culture than has been examined yet. And I would like to see a lot more Scottish creators be able to talk about where they came from, because the mythology I borrow from is very well known in Scotland. Like a selkie is just like, usually they kind of look like seals in Scottish mythology. They look like seals, but essentially they're changelings. So when they come ashore, they are in human form. And so people often like, when your husband, who's a fisherman, doesn't come home, like one of the explanations you might give is like, oh, well, he's a selkie, he's gone back to the sea. But in fact, like, he's drowned. So it's like a nice story you can tell your kids. And like, obviously it's like something that people, it's strange because people they don't think that fairies are real, but they do just evoke fairies as being there. And it's like a kind of I don't know, like fairies are all around us in Scotland and they do these things, and like if there's a thing that can't be explained, it's the fairies, and that's it. And that's kind of what I grew up with. Is my grandma used to say to me not to go down to the bottom of the garden or the fairies will take me away. The fairies will get you was like a way of like keeping your children close to you. And so I grew up with a lot of that, and it's not necessarily gone away with modern life. It's just something that's like a background thing. And so I thought, well, why not use that for our mythology? Because, in the Marvel universe, there's Banshee. Yes. Banshee exists and stuff like that. So I thought, well, why not, just use these bizarre tales. And yeah. I mean, at least, like, I just feel like it would be sort of strange to like a lot of the ways that the world works now exist because people have appropriated other cultures' ideas and stuff. And I was like, why can't I just like appropriate my own culture?
Yeah, that makes sense. And also I feel like it really like gives the reader, like, you empathize with these characters by how the comic is written, and they're Scottish characters. So you empathize with characters that are written from a personal perspective. And I think that's great, better than to put like characters that are like, universal or something, which doesn't exist. And I feel like that's a strong point of the comic. And the probably last thing I want to ask you is like about the ending, without spoiling a lot. I feel like one of the things that is great about this comic is that there's, as you have explained before, like horizontal harm done, and the comic deals with the vertical harm, the sexual assault, but it also deals with the conflict that happens between some of these final girls. And the last scene of the comic is a reconciliation that doesn't feel forced, that feels like earned, because it's not like the character doesn't like apologize and then they're good. They apologize and then a while later they have a really earned reconciliation that stems from them understanding that they have been the target of a similar type of harm. And I feel like that's a really, really powerful point. And I try to say all of that without spoiling the whole thing. But I want to ask you, like, if that's something that also you did to help the reader feel better with the comic. Because I feel like, for me, it really felt like I would have loved to have this kind of support in some of the experience I have had in my life. And it really like made me feel supported at the moment. Even if I didn't have that kind of support, seeing them come to this point of like understanding each other made me feel really supported. So I want to ask you that, if that's on purpose.
Yeah, it is on purpose. I also want to say I feel like it isn't a very realistic ending. For the exact reasons that you state, where people don't often want to admit that they have been wrong and they've also perpetuated harm. But I feel like I have had like instances in my personal life where people have like, you know, made the wrong judgment about me or whatever, and then later, years later, like come back and apologize and been like, actually, I'm really sorry, like I didn't realize at the time what I was doing, blah blah blah. And I kind of drew from that and was like, well, on a longer scale, let's say years, then the happy ending may occur, right? And so I did kind of take from that. I did want to kind of, I mean, it was actually Katie that said to me, like, you need something to actually wind this up. And I want to know what happens to Ash, basically. So Ash gets her ending mainly because Katie was like, no, she what does happen to Ash? We really need to know. And so, yeah, so it's very much about, you know, basically the fantasy of what I would like to see happen more often, because I've been really inspired by, you know, like Ursula Le Guin, who is essentially always writing these amazing stories about what she would like to see happen in communities. And, you know, like I think her just saying, like, if we should essentially be, to paraphrase her, like we should be writing what we want to see happen in the world, right? We should be able, if we can't imagine like the better way, then it won't happen. We have to think about, you know, writers and creators should be thinking about how we can create a better way, because then if we imagine it, then it can't be that far away. And so I thought a lot about that, and I was like, well, the harder thing to do instead of a revenge story would be to imagine how we could get better and what we would like to see happen in that kind of situation, and how we could possibly go around addressing it. And obviously I based it on like real things that people do, but it's not currently, I think everyone is so obsessed with, you know, like the cop story of like, you know, these are the good guys and these are the bad guys, and
Yes,
this is how we deal with them as we kick their ass. And that's cool and everything, and I enjoy those stories, but it's not something that we're so bound up in that mentality. I don't think we can see a way out of it, and I wanted to try to imagine one.
so that's sadly what I got from the story. So I think on my side you succeeded.
Yeah, I mean, I just kind of wanted to fantasize about like how best to fix the problem. And it was really hard, like, to write, because I was so scared. Like you say, it was taking such huge risks, and I was so scared I was going to make a misstep and like make people upset, or like, you know, I don't know, for like so many reasons. Like as you said before, I was really scared that it wasn't going to land with people. But as soon as I read what you had written, I was like, this is going to get to the right people, and it's probably going to help them and let them know, you know, like I really wanted it to land with people. And I know that even if you haven't experienced like these, you know, abuses yourself as well, you can identify with, you know, that bit where Skathak is like, why won't you fucking do something? You know, like that bit where she's talking to Parrot, she's just like, do something. Why don't you just do something? You can do something. Why don't you just help? You know? And so I feel like feeling every day where, you know, it's like so on the nose to call that guy Power, but like Power, the only way that things can move forward is if Power participates in the solution, right? And so that's what I wanted to say. But yeah, like it is, again, like a lot of the ways in which I was writing was to illuminate the fact that, you know, I live in Scotland. Scotland's a small community. Almost all of my heroes are Scottish, some of them aren't. But like essentially, you know, that's a small community that like, you know, it's close to home. It's close to home for everyone, the way that these things work, how power abuses people, you know. So yeah, it's just this thing I was scared about not landing, and I'm so happy that it could land for you.
So I want to ask you about your other things, like your projects that you have. You have maybe things for the future, or like I don't know what you're up to after this. Just like
Yeah. So so I've been a narrative designer since about
Mhm.
2015. So before that, obviously, some people might know me from my journalism career. So I was a journalist before that, and I wrote a book as well. And so I published a book about traveling around the world and speaking to people about their work. But there basically my main job now is designing video games and like designing how they tell stories, and that was really helpful for comics actually, because that is also very constrained by like technicalities and like how long you have and like how costly things are. So a lot of that is very helpful. But before this I did a game called Dreams, which is out on PS4, which is a wonderful place where you can basically use your PS4 to create a world yourself and publish it, and then other people can play it, and it's really cool. And then I also did narrative design for a game called Void Bastards, which is actually about, actually similarly, it's a game about escaping incarceration. So it's basically a game about some people who are stuck in a ship in space and they're prisoners, and the idea is to try and escape. So that is kind of a similar anti-prison narrative. But it is also really fun, and it's like kind of like a, you know, like a strategic kind of game. And then I also am working on a game with League of Geeks in Australia, and they're amazing, and I can't wait for people to see what's happening there. It's really great. And yeah, like upcoming projects, like I feel like games take like years and years and years and years to make, so it's really hard to make a call as to like what exactly comes next. But I always have something on the go. I'm trying to write a tabletop RPG, which I don't know if that's going to go well or not. And yeah, like lots of different things on the go. But yeah, I would like to do another comic, but it might be
please
a while until I get around to it. But we'll see, because I think the next one is going to be a lot trashier. It's going to be like a lot less high-minded than like, you know, solving the problem of like restorative justice or whatever. It's probably not going to be that. It's probably going to be more like, I don't know, some trashy vampires bite each other and it's
yay
sexy. I don't know. I watched like have you ever seen that movie Delamarte Delamore? It's like an old 90s movie. Rupert Everett basically is like, he takes care of a cemetery, and essentially like every 7 days, like after death, like people rise from the dead and he has to kill them again. So he's like, it's his job to keep everyone in the cemetery, and it's very, very funny. All he does is like smoke stuff. He looks sexy. He smokes. He has a shower in the cemetery. He just gets naked, and then he shoots all of these zombies. It's perfect. I just want to write something trashy like that, where I'm like, it's like kind of gay and kind of sexy and in a cemetery maybe, but we'll see.
I'm in. I'm in for the spits.
But yeah, no, I have so many things that are at the start that I don't know whether they'll come through. So it's always a hazard to say anything about it too early. So
But that was a good tease. So thank you so much for coming to chat with me. This has been amazing. For all the people that will watch this when it gets published, you can find The Final Girls at Comixology. It's very, very easy to find. And you will find the rest of Cara's work on a website that is also linked in the video. So it's all going to be very, very easy to find. And I'm sure people are going to be excited about this. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you so much especially for actually like caring so much about the comic that you found the flaws as well, because I think that's like the ultimate sign of someone loving something, is being like, this is great, but also I would prefer if this were better. I think that's like the hallmark of everything being, you know, the way it should be. It's all in the details.